Before the first sunrise ever touched the waters of Toriel, before the continents bore names or the gods walked among their chosen peoples, there existed only the raw substance of creation itself. The world that would become the Forgotten Realms began as a sphere of molten possibility, circling a young sun in a crystal sphere that drifted through the endless expanse of the phlogiston. In those primeval moments, forces beyond mortal comprehension shaped the very bones of existence. The elemental chaos that preceded order was not empty. It churned with potential, with the building blocks of stone and sea and sky, waiting for the hands that would give it form. What emerged from that crucible of creation would become one of the most storied worlds in all the multiverse, a land where gods and mortals would clash across countless ages, where empires would rise to touch the heavens and fall into dust, and where the very nature of magic itself would be written, unwritten, and written again. The earliest era of Toriel's formation remains shrouded in mystery, even to the most learned sages. The primordials, those vast elemental beings of pure chaos, held dominion over the cooling world in an age before time had meaning. These entities were not gods in any recognizable sense. They were forces of nature given terrible consciousness, beings of fire and stone and storm and sea who shaped the land according to their whims. The continents buckled and reformed at their passage. Mountains erupted from plains in moments. Oceans boiled and froze in the span of what might have been hours or might have been millennia. There was no order to impose measurement upon this chaos. The primordials knew nothing of worship or followers or the subtle arrangements of divine power. They simply existed, and in their existence they remade the world endlessly. Yet even chaos contains the seeds of pattern. From somewhere beyond the material sphere, or perhaps from within the fundamental structure of reality itself, other powers took notice of this world of potential. The gods arrived on Toriel not as conquerors but as claimants, divine entities drawn by the promise of worship and the sustenance it would provide. Their coming did not go unchallenged. The primordials saw these interlopers as threats to their dominion, foreign powers seeking to impose structure upon their magnificent disorder. What followed was not a war in any mortal sense. It was a cosmic conflagration that reshaped the very nature of the world. The Dawn War, as later scholars would name it, pitted the ordered fury of the gods against the chaotic might of the primordials across every corner of Toriel and into the planes themselves. The battles of the Dawn War scarred the world in ways that persist to the present day. The Sea of Fallen Stars, that vast inland ocean that would later divide the great powers of Faerun, was carved by the thrashing of a dying primordial whose name has been forgotten. The mountains of the spine of the world were thrust upward as barriers against elemental incursion. Whole regions of the Underdark collapsed into existence as the ground itself became a battlefield. The gods fought not with swords and spells, as mortals would understand them, but with the fundamental forces of creation. Deities whose names would later be spoken in reverence across 1,000 temples marshaled their divine essence against beings of pure elemental fury. Some gods fell in those conflicts, their divine sparks scattered across the plains. Others rose to prominence through their victories, establishing the hierarchies that would govern the celestial order for ages to come. The primordials were not destroyed. Such beings cannot truly die in the way that mortals or even gods can perish. But they were bound, imprisoned, driven into the deepest places of the world, or cast into dimensional prisons that would hold them for eternity. Some retreated to the elemental chaos from which they had emerged, content to abandon this sphere to the ordered rule of the divine. The cost of this victory was immense. The world had been broken and remade so many times that the very nature of reality had shifted. But from this chaos emerged something precious: stability, a world where life could take root and flourish, a world where the gods could cultivate their faithful and draw power from mortal devotion. The foundation had been laid for everything that would follow. Above all of this, watching with patience that defied comprehension, stood Ao. The Overgod did not participate in the Dawn War. Ao did not take sides between primordial and deity. His role was something altogether different, something that would not be fully understood until ages later, when his direct intervention would reshape the divine order of Toriel. Au was the supreme arbiter of the cosmic balance, the being who had set the rules by which gods and worlds operated. He did not create the gods who came to Toriel, nor did he summon them there. But once they had claimed this world as their own, they fell under his authority. The gods of Toriel would serve their faithful, would draw power from worship, and would maintain the portfolios assigned to them. These were not suggestions. They were laws woven into the fabric of divine existence on this world. Au rarely acted, rarely made his presence known, but his laws were absolute, and no god, however mighty, could violate them without consequence. In the aftermath of the Dawn War, with the primordials defeated and the divine hierarchy establishing itself, the first true civilizations began to emerge. These were not the civilizations of elves or humans or dwarves. They were far older, far stranger, and in many ways far more powerful. The creator races, as later scholars would call them, arose in the age that would be remembered as the Days of Thunder. These beings were the original masters of Toriel, creatures who built empires and wielded magic in ways that even the greatest human archmages would later struggle to comprehend. The Saruk were perhaps the most successful of these creator races. These serpentine beings established their dominion across the tropical regions of what would become Faerun, building mighty empires in Okoth, Istosefifil, and Meerschauk. The Saruk were not merely builders and conquerors, they were shapers of life itself. Their mastery of magical manipulation allowed them to twist and transform other creatures into new forms, creating entire species to serve their needs. The Yuan-Ti, those serpentine humanoids who would trouble later ages, were among their creations. So too were the Nagas, the Terrafolk, and countless other reptilian races whose origins trace back to Sarach experimentation. Their empires sprawled across vast territories, their ziggurats rising from jungle and swamp, their magical researches pushing into realms of power that rivaled the gods themselves. But the Saruk were not alone in their dominion. The Batraki claimed the swamps and wetlands of ancient Toriel, amphibian beings whose empires rose in regions that would later be transformed beyond recognition. These frog-like creators were masters of portal magic, weaving connections between the material plane and other realms in ways that even the Saruk could not match. Some scholars believe that the Batrachi's portal experiments were responsible for releasing the first demons onto Toriel, though this theory remains contested in arcane circles. The Bullywugs and other amphibious races of later ages carry traces of Batrachi heritage, though their creators had long since vanished before these diminished descendants rose to sentience. The Aeri built their civilizations in the high peaks and floating earth moats of ancient Toriel. These avian beings claimed the skies as their domain, constructing eyries and aerial cities that would not be matched until the flying cities of Netheril took to the air millennia later. The Aeri created the Aarakocra and other bird-like races, populating the skies with their servants and soldiers. Their empire of Viaku spread across the star mounts and other high places, a realm of wind and wing that commanded vast territories from above. The Aeri were warriors as much as builders, and their conflicts with the other creator races shaped the political geography of the Days of Thunder. For tens of thousands of years, the creator races dominated Toriel. Their empires waxed and waned, made war upon each other, and sometimes forged alliances of convenience. The Saruk in particular reached heights of power that bordered on the divine. Some of their number achieved a form of apotheosis, becoming living gods to their followers. Others delved so deeply into magic that they transformed themselves into beings of pure arcane energy, transcending their physical forms entirely. The great city of Oreme, built by the Saruk in the depths of what would later become the Forest of Amtar, was said to contain libraries of magical knowledge that would have taken human scholars lifetimes to merely catalogue, let alone comprehend. Yet even the creator races could not endure forever. The fall of these ancient empires came not from a single cataclysm, but from a gradual collapse that spanned millennia. The Saruk retreated from their surface territories, their numbers declining, their empires fragmenting into isolated enclaves. Some descended into the Underdark, establishing hidden cities that would persist in secret for ages to come. Others entered magical hibernation, sealing themselves away in enchanted vaults to await an awakening that might never come. The Batraki faded similarly, their portal networks breaking down, their populations dwindling until only their creations remained to remember them. The Aeri abandoned their high cities, retreating to distant mountains or transforming themselves to escape some doom that has never been fully explained. The reasons for this collapse remain debated among sages. Some point to changing climates that made Toriel less hospitable to the creator races. Others cite the cumulative damage of their endless wars, conflicts that depleted resources and populations over thousands of years. A few scholars argue that the creator races became victims of their own success, that their magical experimentation unleashed forces they could not control. The truth likely involves all of these factors and more. What is certain is that the days of thunder eventually ended, and with their conclusion, the world entered a new age. The changing of ages did not happen suddenly. As the creator races declined, new peoples rose to inherit their legacy. The elves, who would later claim to be the first of the younger races, began their long history on Toriel in this transitional period. Their origins are shrouded in myth and contested legend. Some elven texts claim that the fair folk were created by Corellon Larethian, their chief deity, who drew them from the beauty of the world itself. Others suggest that the elves evolved naturally on Toriel, shaped by the magical residue left behind by the departing creator races. Still others maintain that the elves came to Toriel from another world entirely, migrants from a distant crystal sphere who found this world suited to their nature. Whatever their origins, the elves established themselves across Faerun in the ages following the creator race withdrawal. They were not yet unified, not yet the great civilization they would become. These early elves were scattered tribes and small settlements, learning to survive in a world still dangerous from the lingering legacies of ancient powers. But they were growing, spreading, claiming territories that had once belonged to the Saruk and Batrachi and Aeri. The forests particularly drew them, and in the great woodlands of what would become the Ewerwood, the forest of Cormanthor, and the High Forest, elven communities took root and began their slow rise to prominence. The dwarves emerged from the mountains in this same era, though their origins were different from the elves. According to dwarven tradition, they were created by Moradin, the All-Father, forged in his divine smithy from the living rock of the world itself. The first dwarves awoke deep within the mountains of northern Faerun, in caverns that still held the heat of their creation. From these depths, they spread outward and downward, establishing the foundations of civilizations that would endure for millennia. The great dwarven kingdoms of Shanatar and Ogran, and dozens of others trace their lineages back to these earliest days, when the stout folk first learned to work stone and metal in ways that would never be surpassed. Humans came later still, and their origins on Toriel remain perhaps the most mysterious of all. Unlike the elves and dwarves, humans claim no divine creator, no mythic point of genesis. They simply appeared, arising in multiple regions simultaneously, as if the world itself had decided that such creatures were needed. These early humans were primitive by later standards, tribes of hunters and gatherers who competed with each other and with the other races for resources and territory. But they possessed something that the longer-lived races lacked: ambition married to urgency. With lifespans measured in decades rather than centuries, humans built quickly, adapted rapidly, and spread across the continent with a vigor that astonished their elven and dwarven neighbors. The rise of these younger races marked the beginning of a new age in Toriel's history. In the millennia that followed the decline of the creator races, the elves achieved the greatest heights of any civilization in the early age of the younger races. Their rise was not swift by human standards. It unfolded across thousands of years, a gradual accumulation of power and knowledge and magical mastery that eventually produced the great elven empires. The first of these unified realms emerged in what would later be called the time of the first flowering, a golden age that saw the elves claim dominion over vast swaths of Faerun. Arivandar rose in the cold forests of the north, its borders eventually stretching from the spine of the world to the Sea of Swords. This empire of sun elves became the most powerful of the early elven nations, its armies equipped with weapons and armor of exceptional craft, its wizards commanding magics that could reshape the land itself. The high mages of Arivandar pioneered forms of elven magic that would be studied and envied for ages afterward. Their capital was a city of impossible beauty, its towers reaching toward the sky, its gardens blooming with flowers that existed nowhere else in the world. The rulers of Arivandar styled themselves as the natural leaders of all elven kind, a claim that brought them into conflict with other elven nations. To the south, Mieritar established itself as a nation of dark elves and green elves, a woodland realm of artists and philosophers who cared little for the martial ambitions of their northern cousins. The dark elves of Mieritar were not yet the drow of later ages. They were surface dwellers, their dark skin marking them as children of a different elven tradition but not yet twisted by the corruption that would later claim their descendants. Mieritar was known for its magical innovations, its contributions to elven music and art, and its tolerance for the differences among elven kind. This very tolerance would eventually doom them. Ilafan rose in the lands that would later become the Sword Coast, a realm of moon elves and wood elves who balanced the martial traditions of Arivandar with the creative spirit of Mieritar. Keltormir claimed the southern forests, another nation of wood elves who lived in harmony with the natural world and cared little for the politics of their northern kin. Chantel Othrea, Theanitar, Aelur, and numerous smaller realms filled the spaces between these greater powers, each pursuing its own interpretation of what elven civilization should become. For a time, these nations existed in relative peace. The wars that would devastate elvenkind did not begin with armies and battles. They began with politics, with marriages and alliances and the endless maneuvering of noble houses seeking advantage. The Sun Elves of Arivandar, convinced of their own superiority, began to pressure other elven nations to acknowledge their leadership. Diplomatic missions gave way to demands, demands gave way to threats. When Mieritar refused to submit to Arivandar's hegemony, the stage was set for catastrophe. The Crown Wars, as later historians would name this long series of conflicts, lasted nearly 3,000 years. They were not a single war but a series of them, 5 great conflicts separated by uneasy pieces that merely allowed the combatants to recover before the next eruption of violence. The First Crown War saw Arivandar invade Mieritar, beginning a campaign of conquest that would span centuries. The initial stages favored the aggressors, their superior military organization overwhelming the more loosely structured defenses of their victims. But Mieritar did not fall easily. Its people retreated into the depths of their forests, waging a guerrilla campaign that bled Arivandar's armies for generation after generation. The Second Crown War expanded the conflict, drawing in Ilithia, a dark elven nation in the far south that had remained neutral during the First War. Ilithia entered the fighting not to aid Mieritar, but to pursue its own territorial ambitions, taking advantage of the chaos to expand its borders. The Dark Elves of Ilithia were different from their Mieritar cousins. They had begun to worship dark powers, to embrace philosophies of domination and cruelty that set them apart from other elven kind. Their entry into the Crown Wars added a new dimension of horror to conflicts that were already devastating. The destruction of Mieritar came during the Third Crown War, and it remains one of the most terrible events in elven history. The High Mages of Arivandar, frustrated by their inability to achieve final victory through conventional means, turned to magic of unprecedented destructive power. What they unleashed was called the Dark Disaster, a killing wave of magical energy that swept across the entirety of Mieritar and destroyed everything in its path. Every living thing within the nation's borders perished. The forests died, the rivers turned to poison, the very soil became corrupted, unable to support life. Hundreds of thousands of elves died in moments, and the land itself was transformed into the barren wasteland that would later be called the High Moor. This atrocity shocked all of elvenkind, but it did not end the wars. The surviving dark elves of the region were forced to flee southward, many finding refuge in Ilithia. There, they were absorbed into that nation's population, bringing with them their grief and their hatred for the Sun Elves of Arivandar. This migration strengthened Ilithia even as it deepened that nation's turn toward darkness. The priests of Ilithia invoked powers that should never have been called upon. They bound demons to their service. They made pacts with entities from the lower planes. They transformed their nation into something that other elves could barely recognize as kin. The Fourth Crown War saw Ilithia's full descent into darkness made manifest. The Dark Elves unleashed plagues that spread through the forests of their enemies, magical diseases that killed thousands. They summoned extraplanar creatures to fight alongside their armies. They practiced necromancy on a scale never before seen among elvenkind, raising their own fallen soldiers to continue fighting. The other elven nations, finally recognizing the common threat, began to put aside their differences to face the Dark Elves of Ilithia. But their response came late, and the damage had already been done. The Fifth Crown War brought the final reckoning. The elven nations that had suffered under Ilithia's cruelty called upon their gods for intervention. What they received was beyond anything they had hoped or feared. Corillon, Larethian, and the other elven deities answered, but their response was not military assistance, it was divine judgment. The Dark Elves of Ilithia and all Dark Elves who had embraced the worship of Lolth and the other dark powers were cursed. Their skin darkened further, becoming the ebon shade that would mark the drow forever after. Their eyes became sensitive to light, and they were driven from the surface world entirely, forced to flee into the Underdark, where they would build new civilizations far from the sun they could no longer tolerate. This transformation, called the Descent, did not merely punish the Dark Elves. It fundamentally divided elvenkind into surface and subterranean branches that would remain hostile for tens of thousands of years. The drow would remember their exile with hatred, passing down their grievances through generation after generation. The surface elves would remember the horrors of the Crown Wars, their fear and distrust of their dark cousins becoming ingrained cultural attitudes that no amount of time could fully heal. The Crown Wars left the elven nations shattered. Arivandar, the instigator of so much suffering, collapsed under the weight of its own crimes. Its ruling houses turned upon each other, fighting civil wars that completed the destruction the external conflicts had begun. The other elven nations fared little better. Populations had been decimated, ancient forests had been burned or corrupted. The magical resources that had sustained elven civilization for millennia had been expended in centuries of warfare. What remained of the great elven empires was a shadow of what had existed before. In the aftermath of the Crown Wars, the surviving elves began the long process of rebuilding. Some returned to simpler ways of life, abandoning the magical and military ambitions that had led to so much destruction. Others gathered in new nations, determined to preserve what remained of elven high culture. The greatest of these successor states was Cormanthia, which would rise in the forests of central Faerun to become the most magnificent elven civilization of the age. But even as the elves rebuilt, they were no longer the dominant power on the continent. Their time of absolute supremacy had passed. The decline of elven power created space for other civilizations to rise. The dwarves had never stopped expanding during the Crown Wars, their underground realms growing even as the surface world burned. The great kingdom of Shanatar, founded in the caverns beneath what would later be called Am, became one of the most powerful dwarf holds in history. Its 8 sub-kingdoms controlled vast territories in the Underdark, their miners extracting wealth from the stone, while their warriors defended against the constant threats that lurked in the depths. Shanatar's influence extended to the surface as well, its traders establishing relationships with the emerging human settlements that were beginning to dot the coastlines. But even Shanatar could not escape conflict. The dwarves found themselves fighting wars on multiple fronts, against drow who had established their own territories in the Underdark, against illithids and other aberrations that saw dwarf flesh as sustenance, against each other, as the various sub-kingdoms competed for resources and prestige. The Spawn Wars devastated portions of Shanatar, prolonged conflicts against the aberrations of the deep that cost countless dwarf lives. The sub-kingdoms grew apart, their unity fragmenting, their cooperation giving way to rivalry. By the time Shanatar finally collapsed, its territories had already been divided into independent realms that no longer acknowledged any central authority. Humans, meanwhile, were achieving something that neither elves nor dwarves had managed. The human capacity for rapid adaptation and expansion allowed them to fill the vacuum left by declining elven power. While the long-lived races measured progress in centuries, humans thought in decades and acted in years. They built quickly, bred quickly, and died quickly. But they left behind children who continued their work. Within a few thousand years of their first appearance on Toriel, humans had spread across virtually every habitable region of Faerun. They were not yet organized into great nations. They were tribes and villages, petty kingdoms and wandering bands, but their numbers grew constantly, and their presence could not be ignored. The first human empire to achieve true greatness arose not in Faerun but to the east, in the lands that would later be called Rorin. Imaskar was an empire of magic, founded by wizards who had discovered arcane secrets that rivaled the high magic of the elves. The Imaskari did not merely study magic, they bent it to purposes of conquest and domination. Their artificers created wonders that would not be matched for millennia. Their portals connected their empire to distant worlds, allowing them to draw resources and slaves from across the multiverse. It was this practice of slavery that would ultimately doom Imaskar. The Imaskari artificers opened portals to a world where humans lived in bondage to powerful beings. They brought thousands of these humans through to Toriel, putting them to work in Imaskari fields and mines and cities. But the slaves brought their gods with them, or rather, they called out to their gods across the vast distances that separated the worlds. The Mulhorandi and Untheric pantheons answered. These deities manifested on Toriel in response to the prayers of their faithful, bringing divine vengeance against the Imaskari slavers. The war that followed was unlike anything Faerun had seen since the Crown Wars. The Imaskari artificers were powerful, their magic capable of challenging gods. They erected magical barriers that prevented the deities from manifesting fully in their territory. They created constructs and weapons designed specifically to harm divine beings. For a time, it seemed that mortal magic might actually triumph over the gods themselves. But gods are patient, and their resources are vast. The Mulhorandi and Untheric deities established their own nations on Toriel, gathering their freed slaves into populations that could generate worship and power. They sent their servants, the Asimon, and other Celestials, to wage war against the Imaskari. They supported rebellion among the slave populations still held within the empire, and they waited for the moment when Imaskari power would falter. That moment came in a catastrophe whose origins remain debated among scholars. Some say the Imaskari artificers pushed their magic too far, opening a portal to something that should have remained forever sealed. Others claim that the gods themselves struck the killing blow, unleashing divine fury that mortal magic could not withstand. What is certain is that Imaskar fell, its cities destroyed, its population scattered, its magical wonders buried beneath sand and ruin. The descendants of the freed slaves established their own nations in the wake of this collapse. Mulhorand and Unther rose in the east, nations ruled by god-kings who walked among their people in mortal form. These were strange realms by the standards of Western Faerun. In Mulhorand and Unther, the gods did not merely receive worship. They governed directly, their avatars sitting upon thrones and making laws and leading armies. The pharaohs of Mulhorand claimed descent from Re and Osiris and the other deities of their pantheon. The god-kings of Unther held absolute power over their subjects, demanding worship as their divine right. This direct rule created societies unlike any others in Faerun, nations where the distinction between religious and civil authority did not exist because the gods themselves were the state. Yet even gods could fall into conflict with each other. The wars between Mulhorand and Unther shaped the eastern reaches of Faerun for millennia. These were not merely political conflicts, but theological ones, battles between divine powers competing for worshippers and territory. The gods themselves sometimes took the field, their clashes devastating the landscapes over which they fought. Lesser deities fell in these conflicts, their divine essences dispersed or absorbed by their killers. The mortal populations caught between the warring god-kings suffered terribly, their lives and deaths mere footnotes in the larger celestial struggle. While the god-kings warred in the east, a different kind of civilization was rising in the north. Netheril began as a collection of fishing villages along the shores of the narrow sea, humans who had learned a few simple magical cantrips to ease their daily labors. They were primitive by any sophisticated standard, their magic barely worthy of the name. But among them arose an individual who would change everything. Nether the Elder, whose name would later be given to the empire he founded, discovered something in the ruins of ancient Arivandar. Some accounts say it was a buried library. Others claim it was a single scroll of immense power. Whatever he found, it contained knowledge of the Nether Scrolls, the legendary artifacts created by some unknown power in the earliest ages of the world. The Nether Scrolls contained magical knowledge beyond anything humans had previously possessed. Nether shared his discovery, and from that sharing arose an explosion of magical development that transformed northern Faerun. Within generations, Netherese arcanists had progressed from cantrips to magics that rivaled the greatest elven high mages. Within centuries, they had surpassed them. The Netherese developed spellcasting, traditions that remained in use long after their empire had fallen. They created magical items of unprecedented power. They built wonders that previous ages would have thought impossible. The most spectacular of these wonders were the floating cities. The arcanist Iulam, perhaps the greatest wizard in Netherese history, pioneered the magic that allowed entire cities to be lifted from the ground and suspended in the sky. The first of these floating enclaves, Shin Lanal, rose into the air around -3,500 Dale reckoning, marking a new era in Netherese development. Other arcanists quickly followed Iulam's example, competing to create ever more magnificent aerial domains. At its height, Netheril boasted dozens of floating cities, each one a marvel of magical engineering, their populations living literally above the concerns of the earthbound world. Life in the floating cities was a thing of wonder. The archwizards who ruled these enclaves commanded magic sufficient to fulfill almost any desire. Food was conjured rather than grown. Distances were covered by teleportation rather than walking. Servants were created from magical energy, tireless automatons who attended to every need. The Netherese who lived in these cities knew luxury beyond anything the ground-dwelling populations could imagine. They devoted themselves to magical research, to philosophical contemplation, to pleasures both refined and decadent. They believed themselves masters of the world, and for a time they were correct. But power of this magnitude demanded a price. The Netherese arcanists drew their magic from the weave, the fundamental structure of arcane power that permeated Toriel. This weave was maintained by Mistril, the goddess of magic, who served as both its guardian and its connection to mortal spellcasters. The Netherese pushed against the limits of what the weave could support, developing spells of such power that they strained the very fabric of magical reality. Some arcanists began to fear that they were approaching a threshold beyond which lay disaster. Others dismissed such concerns as cowardice, continuing to pursue ever greater magical achievements. The empire continued to expand even as these tensions grew. At its greatest extent, Netheril controlled territories stretching from the narrow sea to the edges of the great desert. Its influence extended further still, as other nations sought alliances with the mighty floating cities. The Netherese traded their magical knowledge for resources and political advantages, spreading their arcane traditions across Faerun. Students came from distant lands to study under Netherese masters. Merchants grew wealthy, carrying goods between the surface and the enclaves above. The empire seemed eternal, its power unassailable. The encroaching desert changed that illusion. Anorok had once been fertile land, part of the territories that Netheril claimed as its own. But something was transforming it into wasteland, a spreading desolation that consumed farms and forests, and eventually whole cities. The Netherese arcanists investigated this phenomenon, seeking to understand and reverse it, but their efforts failed. The desert continued to grow, swallowing the ground-based portions of the empire while the floating cities watched helplessly from above. Some scholars believe that the desert's spread was connected to the Netherese abuse of magical power, that they had somehow damaged the land's ability to sustain life. Others point to external causes, including interference by the Faerim. The Faerim were alien creatures of terrible intelligence and malevolence. These beings dwelt beneath the earth, creatures that resembled nothing so much as massive thorny worms with immense magical abilities. They despised surface life and worked constantly to destroy it. Their magic drained life energy from the land above, contributing to the spread of Anorok. When the Netherese finally discovered the Faerim's role in their empire's decline, they attempted to destroy their underground enemies. But the Faerim proved resistant to even Netherese magic, their alien nature providing defenses against spells designed to affect more conventional creatures. This crisis prompted one arcanist to attempt something unprecedented. Karsus was ambitious, even by Netherese standards, a wizard who believed that the solution to every problem was more power. When the Empire faced destruction from the Faerim, he conceived a plan to save it by stealing divine power itself. Karsus developed a spell of unprecedented magnitude, magic designed to temporarily usurp the portfolio of a god. His target was Mistral, the goddess of magic, whose power he believed would give him the ability to destroy the Faerim and save Netheril. The spell worked, after a fashion. For a brief moment, Karsus held the power of a god. Divine energy flowed through his mortal form, granting him awareness and capability beyond anything he had previously imagined. But the experience immediately revealed his catastrophic error. The weave, the structure of magic that supported every enchantment in Netheril, depended on Mistral's constant attention and maintenance. When Karsus seized her power, that attention was interrupted. The weave began to unravel. Throughout Netheril, magic failed. The floating cities, held aloft by the most powerful enchantments ever created, began to fall. The protective wards that maintained the enclave's environments collapsed, the magical servants ceased to function, and the weave itself threatened to tear apart entirely, which would have ended magic on Toriel forever. Mistral, in the final moment, before Karsus's theft was complete, made a choice. She sacrificed herself, allowing her divine essence to be destroyed in order to reform the weave before it could collapse entirely. Her death ended Karsus's brief divinity, leaving him a mortal man who had just witnessed the consequences of his ambition. Karsus died when his flying enclave struck the ground. Dozens of other enclaves fell as well, their populations killed instantly as their cities crashed into the earth. The magical wonder that was Netheril ended in a single day, the greatest human civilization yet created destroyed by the hubris of one wizard. The few survivors, those who had been on the ground or who managed to teleport to safety, scattered across Faerun. The territories that had been Netheril became part of the expanding Anorok. The floating cities, those magnificent achievements of magical engineering, became ruins buried beneath sand and stone. The goddess who replaced Mistral took the name Mistra. This new deity of magic learned from her predecessor's fate. She established rules limiting the power of spells that mortals could cast, ensuring that no future wizard could attempt what Karsus had done. The most powerful magics, those that had allowed Netheril to achieve its greatest wonders, were banned entirely. Mortals could still cast spells of tremendous power, but there were now absolute limits that even the greatest arcanists could not exceed. These restrictions would shape the development of magic on Toriel for millennia to come, preventing both the heights and the depths that unlimited arcane power might otherwise have achieved. The fall of Netheril sent shockwaves across Faerun. Nations that had relied on Netherese trade suddenly found themselves isolated. Students who had been studying in the floating cities returned home to rebuild what they could from memory. Magical traditions that had been centralized in Netheril now dispersed across the continent, carried by survivors who established new schools and towers in their adopted lands. The age of human magical supremacy had ended, but the knowledge survived, transformed, and diminished, but never entirely lost. In the wake of Netheril's fall, the elves of Cormanthir rose to prominence. This realm, centered on the great forest that shared its name, represented the best of what elven civilization could achieve in the post-Crown War era. The elves of Cormanthir had learned from the mistakes of Arivandar and the other fallen empires. They sought balance rather than domination, harmony with the natural world rather than conquest of it. Their capital of Mithdrana became the greatest city in Faerun, a place where elves and humans and dwarves and other races lived together in peace and mutual prosperity. Mithdrana was not built in a day or a decade or even a century. The city grew gradually, its beauty accumulating across generations. The elven architects who designed its towers and gardens worked with patience unknown to humans, spending lifetimes on projects that would outlast their creators. The result was a city of impossible grace, its buildings flowing with the natural contours of the land, its streets lined with trees that had been cultivated for magical as well as aesthetic purposes. The very air of Mithranor carried enchantments that protected its inhabitants and enhanced their well-being. It was, by universal agreement, the most beautiful city ever built on Faerun. The decision to open Mithdrana to other races was controversial among the elves. Many questioned the wisdom of inviting shorter-lived peoples into their midst, worrying that human ambition and dwarven stubbornness would disrupt the careful balance that elven society had achieved. But the proponents of opening argued that isolation had contributed to the horrors of the Crown Wars, that elven kind needed allies if it was to survive in a changing world. The debate was settled by Coronel Elturgrim, who formally opened the city to non-elves in a ceremony that became known as the Opening. From that day forward, Mithranor welcomed all who came in peace. The results exceeded even the optimists' expectations. The mixing of races in Mithranor produced cultural and magical innovations that neither elves nor humans could have achieved alone. Human wizards learned elven high magic, combining it with their own traditions to create new schools of spellcasting. Elven artisans incorporated dwarven metallurgical techniques into their craft, producing weapons and armor of unprecedented quality. Scholars from all races collaborated on projects of research and discovery. For several centuries, Mithdrana was the intellectual and cultural center of Faerun, a beacon of cooperation in a world still marked by racial distrust. This golden age could not last forever. The forces of evil had never ceased their opposition to Mithdrana. Demons lurked in the shadows, waiting for opportunities to corrupt or destroy. The drow in the Underdark below harbored ancient grudges against their surface cousins, and darker forces still watched the city's success with jealousy and hatred. In the Year of Doom, these forces combined in an assault that would destroy everything the inhabitants of Mithdrana had built. The Army of Darkness, as survivors would later name it, consisted of demons and drow and other creatures of evil united by hatred of the light. Their attack came without warning, a wave of violence that swept through the city's defenses before adequate resistance could be organized. The defenders fought bravely, elves and humans and dwarves standing together against the onslaught, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers and the ferocity of their enemies. The battle lasted for years, a grinding siege that transformed the beautiful city into a charnel house. When it finally ended, Mithdrana was a ruin, its towers broken, its gardens burned, its population dead or fled. The fall of Mithdrana marked the end of the Elven Age in Faerun. Many elves, grieving the loss of their greatest city, chose to leave the continent entirely. They sailed westward across the ocean to Evermeet, the island paradise that had been prepared long ago as a refuge for elvenkind. Those who remained found themselves increasingly marginalized as human kingdoms expanded into territories that elves could no longer hold. The great forests shrank, cut down by human farmers who needed fields, by human builders who needed timber. The elven presence in Faerun did not end, but it diminished, becoming a shadow of what it had been in the days of the great empires. Human civilization expanded into the vacuum left by elven withdrawal. The kingdoms that arose in the wake of Mithrandra's fall would eventually become the great powers of the modern era. Corma began as a collection of border settlements, humans carving a nation from the wilderness at the edge of the great forests. Its early rulers were warriors first and kings second, defending their people against orcs and goblins and the occasional incursion from the fallen city of Mithranor. Over centuries, Cormia grew into a stable kingdom with traditions of law and governance that other nations would later emulate. Waterdeep started as a simple harbor where ships could shelter from storms. Its location proved advantageous for trade, and the harbor grew into a village, then a town, then a city of impressive size. The Lords of Waterdeep, mysterious masked figures who governed the city, established traditions of commerce and neutrality that made their metropolis a hub of continental trade. Waterdeep became a place where merchants from every nation could do business, where adventurers could find patrons and supplies, where the wealth of 100 lands flowed through streets thronged with people of every race. Baldur's Gate arose further south along the same coast. This city lacked the traditions and stability of Waterdeep, but it possessed advantages of its own. Its location gave it control over trade flowing up and down the coast and along the river Chianthar. Its relatively loose governance attracted those who found other cities too restrictive. Baldur's Gate became known as a place of opportunity and danger, where fortunes could be made overnight and lost just as quickly, where the line between legitimate merchant and smuggler was often difficult to discern. Am built its power on trade and the gold that flowed from trade. The merchants of Am were not warriors or wizards. They were businessmen, devoted to the accumulation of wealth, with a single-mindedness that other nations found admirable or disturbing depending on perspective. Am's merchant houses established trading relationships across Faerun and beyond, their ships carrying goods to distant ports while their caravans traversed overland routes. The government of Am served the interests of these merchants, making policies designed to maximize profit rather than territorial expansion. Kalimshan claimed the hot southern coast, building on foundations that predated human civilization. The Jinn and Efreet had once ruled these lands, and their influence persisted in Kalimshite culture and architecture. The Pashas and sultans who governed Kalimshan's cities maintained traditions of luxury and intrigue that were said to rival the courts of the genies themselves. Kalimshan was a land of silk and spice and danger, where beautiful palaces concealed deadly secrets and where a misspoken word could mean death. These kingdoms and a dozen others competed and cooperated as circumstances demanded. Wars erupted regularly, fought over territory or trade routes or ancient grievances. Alliances formed and dissolved as political conditions changed. Merchants sought profit wherever it could be found, indifferent to the nationality of their trading partners. The continent settled into patterns that would persist for centuries, a complex web of relationships that contemporary observers might describe as stability or stagnation depending on their perspective. The divine order maintained during these centuries rested on foundations that mortals rarely contemplated. The gods of Toriel drew their power from worship, their strength waxing and waning as their faithful increased or dwindled. This created a cosmic economy of faith, with deities competing for worshippers the way merchants competed for customers. Some gods gained power through the genuine devotion of their followers, others used manipulation or coercion. A few achieved dominance through the absorption of rival deities, claiming their portfolios and their worshippers when they fell. Mystra watched over the weave, maintaining the structure of magic that allowed arcane spellcasting to function. Her role was unique among the gods, for the weave's integrity affected all spellcasters, regardless of their worship. Mystra had learned from Mistral's fate, establishing firmer limits on magical power while still allowing mortals access to considerable arcane force. She cultivated chosen mortals who served as her agents, the chosen of Mystra who wielded portions of her divine power in service to her goals. These individuals would prove crucial in the events to come. Shah lurked in opposition, the goddess of darkness and secrets plotting eternally against her sister. Where Mystra represented the magic that flowed through the weave, Shah represented the shadow weave, an alternative source of arcane power that existed in the darkness between Mystra's light. Shah's followers were fewer but often more devoted, driven by ambitions and resentments that found expression in the goddess of loss. The rivalry between these two deities would eventually have consequences that reshaped the world itself. The time of troubles began with a theft. The gods Bane and Merkul, deities of tyranny and death, conspired to steal the tablets of fate from Ao himself. These tablets recorded the rules by which the gods operated, the fundamental laws that governed divine behavior on Toriel. Why Bane and Merkul thought they could succeed in this theft remains mysterious. Perhaps they hoped to rewrite the rules in their own favor. Perhaps they simply wanted the knowledge the tablets contained. Whatever their reasons, they achieved their goal, removing the tablets of fate from Ao's possession. Ao's response was swift and terrible. The overgod cast down every deity in the Faerunian pantheon, stripping them of their divine power and forcing them to walk the world in mortal form. These avatar states left the gods vulnerable in ways they had not experienced since before their ascension to divinity. They could be hurt, they could be killed, and if they died in this diminished form, their divine essence would be dispersed forever. Ao declared that the gods would remain in this condition until the tablets of fate were returned to him, making all of them suffer for the crimes of a few. The results were catastrophic. Gods walked openly among mortals, their reduced but still immense powers causing destruction wherever they went. The fighting between rival deities scarred the landscape, their battles killing thousands of innocent bystanders. Bane and Baal and Merkul led armies of mortal followers, seeking to establish earthly dominion that might survive their eventual restoration. Torm and Helm and other good deities fought to protect mortals from the chaos while seeking the stolen tablets. Magic became unstable throughout this period. With the gods disconnected from their normal divine positions, the systems that governed magic fluctuated unpredictably. Spells produced unexpected results. Magical items activated at random. The weave itself shuddered under the strain of divine upheaval. Wizards found themselves unable to trust their own abilities, never certain whether their spells would function as intended. The city of Tantras witnessed the death of Torm. The god of duty and loyalty faced Bane in single combat. Two deities reduced to avatar form fighting with powers that still exceeded anything mortals could match. Their battle destroyed much of the city, but it ended with Torm's destruction of Bane at the cost of his own existence. The god of tyranny was slain, his mortal vessel destroyed, his divine essence scattered. Torm fell as well, giving his life to end his enemy's threat. Helm proved the tragedy of duty in the death of Mystra. The goddess of magic, seeking to return to the celestial planes before the tablets were recovered, approached the celestial stairway that connected the mortal world to the realms above. Helm had been given explicit orders by Ao to guard this passage, allowing no god to pass until the crisis was resolved. When Mystra attempted to force her way through, Helm struck her down, destroying the goddess of magic in fulfillment of his duty. The weave shuddered at its guardian's death, and magic across Toriel fluctuated wildly in the aftermath. Midnight, a mortal wizard who had traveled with Mystra's essence, ascended to fill the void. This woman, chosen by the dying goddess to carry a portion of her divine power, became the new Mystra when the time of troubles ended. She was not the same deity who had preceded her, but she carried the memories and many of the goals of her predecessor. The new Mystra restored stability to the weave, though some claimed that magic never worked quite the same way after the interregnum. Cyric rose from mortality to godhood through murder and betrayal. This mortal man, who had journeyed with Midnight during the crisis, seized the portfolios of the dead gods Bane, Baal, and Merkul. He became the god of strife, lies, and murder, one of the most actively malevolent deities in the pantheon. Cyric's ascension was tainted by madness, and his chaotic nature would cause problems for gods and mortals alike in the years that followed. When Ao finally recovered the tablets of fate, he restored the surviving gods to their divine status. But the time of troubles had changed the relationship between gods and mortals forever. The deities had been vulnerable, had walked among their worshippers, had died. The comfortable assumption that the gods were eternal and unchangeable had been shattered. Some mortals lost faith entirely, unable to worship beings who had proven fallible. Others found their devotion strengthened by the trials they had witnessed. The divine order continued, but it was no longer unquestionable. The weave settled into a new configuration under the restored but transformed Mystra. Magic functioned again, but practitioners noticed subtle differences from the way things had worked before. Some spells became easier to cast, others became more difficult or stopped working entirely. The magical traditions that had developed over millennia required adjustment to these new conditions. Academies and towers across Faerun devoted years to understanding the post-Troubles magical environment. The centuries following the time of Troubles saw the consolidation of mortal power across Faerun. Cormyr grew stronger under capable rulers who expanded its borders and strengthened its institutions. Waterdeep maintained its position as the premier trading city of the Sword Coast, its lords navigating the complex politics of a continent still recovering from divine upheaval. Baldur's Gate expanded, its population swelling as refugees from less stable regions sought the relative safety of its walls. New threats emerged to challenge this stability. The remnants of Zentil Keep, a city that had served as a center of Bane worship before the time of Troubles, rebuilt their strength under new leadership. The Zentarim network, part mercenary company and part criminal organization, extended tendrils across the continent. Their agents worked to destabilize rival powers and establish control over trade routes. While never powerful enough to conquer openly, the Zentarim represented a constant source of interference in the affairs of other nations. The Red Wizards of Thay pursued their own brand of expansion. This magocracy, ruled by wizards who had perfected the art of political infighting, began establishing enclaves in foreign cities. These outposts served as trading centers, selling magical goods that other nations could not produce. They also served as bases for espionage and influence operations, extending Thayan power without military conquest. The Red Wizards were not beloved, but their merchandise was valuable enough that most nations tolerated their presence. Dragons, those ancient powers who had been present since the earliest ages, reasserted themselves periodically. The Cult of the Dragon, a mad organization devoted to the creation of undead dragons, caused destruction wherever they operated. Their theology held that dead dragons would eventually rule the world, and they worked to bring this prophecy to fruition by convincing living dragons to become Dracoliches. Most dragons found this offer unappealing, but enough accepted to create a significant threat. The cult's activities kept adventurers employed across the continent. The Drow never ceased their schemes against the surface world. From Menzoberranzan and other Underdark cities, the Dark Elves launched raids that terrorized surface communities. Their priestesses served Lolth with fanatical devotion, carrying out her will even when it seemed to make no rational sense. The Drow's internal politics, characterized by assassination and betrayal, sometimes spilled over into the surface world when losing factions sought refuge above ground. These refugees brought valuable intelligence about their former homes, but they also brought the paranoia and treachery that defined Drow society. Trade continued to flow despite all these complications. The merchant princes of Waterdeep and the trading houses of Ammon ensured that goods moved across the continent regardless of political conditions. Adventurers provided escort services for valuable caravans, fighting off bandits and monsters who threatened commerce. New trade routes opened as old ones became too dangerous, the patterns of commerce adapting to changing circumstances. Gold proved more durable than any empire, surviving crises that toppled kingdoms. The next great upheaval came without warning. The Spell Plague began in the year of Blue Fire, 1385 Dale Reckoning, when Cyric succeeded in murdering Mystra. The Mad God had never forgiven the goddess of magic for her role in limiting his power, and he had schemed for decades to find a way to destroy her. With the help of Shah, who had always opposed her sister, Cyric finally achieved his goal. He ambushed Mystra in her own realm and slew her, destroying the goddess who maintained the weave. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Without Mystra's guidance, the weave collapsed. Magic across all of Toriel failed simultaneously. every enchantment, every spell, every magical effect ceasing to function in a single terrible moment. Floating objects crashed to earth. Protective wards dissipated. Magical creatures sustained by arcane energy died instantly. And then the spell plague itself erupted, a wave of raw magical chaos that swept across the world. The spell plague transformed everything it touched. Landscapes warped, mountains collapsing while new ones rose, seas draining while dry land flooded. The boundaries between planes weakened, allowing material from other realities to bleed through into Toriel. Portions of the world of Abair, Toriel's lost twin separated since the primordial age, merged with Faerun in a process called the Wailing Years. Entire continents shifted. The geography of the world was rewritten in chaos and fire. Living creatures caught in the spell plague suffered terrible transformations. Some died instantly, their bodies unable to survive the magical bombardment. Others were changed, their flesh reshaping into new and often monstrous forms. The spell-scarred, as survivors came to be called, exhibited strange abilities connected to the raw magic that had transformed them. Some spell-scarred became powerful, their affliction granting abilities that exceeded normal magical limits. Others became wretched, their transformations leaving them physically or mentally diminished. The land itself was permanently altered. The sea of fallen stars drained partially, its waters flowing away through planar rifts that opened during the catastrophe. Enormous chasms called plaguelands remained where the spell plague had been strongest, regions where reality itself remained unstable. These areas were dangerous to enter, as the magical chaos that had created them persisted, threatening to transform or destroy anyone foolish enough to venture within. Magic, when it returned, worked differently than before. The weave had not been destroyed, but it had been fundamentally altered. Spellcasters found that their old methods no longer functioned reliably. Some schools of magic became easier, while others became harder or impossible. The careful balance that Mystra had maintained was gone, replaced by a more chaotic system that required new techniques to navigate. Wizards who had spent decades mastering their craft found themselves essentially beginning again. Civilizations across Faerun collapsed or transformed in response to these changes. The ancient empires of Mulhorand and Unther, already weakened by millennia of decline, suffered particularly heavily. Many of their god-kings, dependent on divine portfolios that were disrupted by the magical catastrophe, lost significant power or disappeared entirely. Mulhorand contracted, abandoning territories it could no longer defend. Unther fragmented into chaos, its population left without the divine guidance that had organized their society for thousands of years. Neverwinter was nearly destroyed. The city that had been known as the Jewel of the North suffered a volcanic eruption triggered by the spell plague's disruption of the magical containment systems that had kept Mount Hotno dormant. Fire and ash buried much of the city. The survivors fled, abandoning their homes to the devastation. For years afterward, Neverwinter remained a ruin, slowly being reclaimed by those brave or desperate enough to rebuild. New powers emerged from the chaos. Netheril returned, after a fashion. The Shadowvar, descendants of one of the floating cities that had survived the ancient empire's fall by fleeing to the plane of shadow, chose this moment of weakness to reclaim their ancestral territories. Their city of Thultanthar, preserved for millennia in the grey realm between worlds, appeared in the skies over Faerun once more. The Shadowvar claimed Anarok as their own, attempting to restore the desert to its pre-Netherese fertility while establishing themselves as a major power. The spell plague years saw the rise of new religious movements. Shah, who had helped cause the catastrophe, attracted worshippers who had lost faith in the other gods. Her clergy preached that darkness and loss were the fundamental truths of existence, and many who had suffered during the spell plague found this message compelling. The Church of Shah expanded dramatically during this period, establishing temples in cities that had previously banned her worship. Cyric, ironically, did not benefit from the chaos he had created. The mad god found himself contained by the other deities, who united against him despite their differences. He was imprisoned, his ability to influence events severely limited. The portfolios he had stolen during the time of troubles were stripped from him, parceled out to other gods, or to new deities who arose to fill the gaps. Cyric's power waned even as the consequences of his actions continued to reshape the world. Nearly a century passed before the next great transformation. The spell plague eventually subsided, its chaotic energy dissipating or being contained. The world adapted to the new conditions, developing new magical traditions, rebuilding shattered civilizations, learning to live with the changes that could not be reversed. The floating city of the Shadowvar remained a fixture in the skies. The plague lands continued to pose dangers, but a new normal established itself, a world transformed but continuing. The Sundering ended this equilibrium. In 1482 Dale Reckoning, events began that would restore the world to something closer to its pre-spell plague configuration. The process is called the Second Sundering to distinguish it from the ancient separation of Aber and Toriel, though the modern event was in many ways a reversal of that primordial division. The worlds that had merged during the spell plague began to separate again, pulling apart the hybrid landscapes that had formed during the crisis. The gods themselves drove much of this process. The deities of Toriel had spent the spell plague decades weakened, their connection to their worshippers disrupted by magical chaos. Now they reasserted themselves, establishing new rules for divine interaction with the mortal world. Ao himself was involved, though as always his purposes remained mysterious. The result was a reshaping of the divine order, a clarification of portfolios and responsibilities that brought structure back to celestial chaos. Mystra returned, or rather a new deity claimed her portfolio. The goddess of magic emerged from whatever fate had claimed her predecessor, bringing the weave fully back to its original configuration. Spells that had not functioned since the spell plague worked again. Magical traditions that had been disrupted were restored. The arbitrary restrictions and unpredictability that had characterized post-spell plague magic gave way to the more stable system that had existed before the catastrophe. The separation of worlds had physical consequences. Territories that had merged with Aber pulled away, tearing free from Faerun to return to their original realm. The landscapes that remained were Toriel's original geography, restored after a century of transformation. Not everything returned to its previous state. Some changes proved permanent, new features that remained even after the separation was complete. But the general effect was a return to familiar geography, a world that long-time residents could recognize again. The Shadowvar fell during this period. Their floating city of Thultan Thar, which had dominated the skies for a century, was destroyed in a confrontation with forces that opposed their plans. The details of this destruction vary depending on the telling, but the result was clear. Netheral's last remnant crashed to Earth, ending the ancient empire's final attempt at restoration. The Shadowvar who survived scattered, their power broken, their dreams of restoration abandoned. Neverwinter was rebuilt. The city that had been destroyed by volcano and plague slowly recovered, drawing settlers who saw opportunity in its ruins. New walls rose where old ones had fallen. New buildings replaced those that had burned. The jewel of the north began to shine again, though it would be years before it approached its former glory. Lord Neverember, a noble from Waterdeep, took a leading role in this reconstruction, establishing himself as the city's effective ruler. Other regions recovered similarly. Cormyr reasserted control over territories that had slipped away during the chaos. Waterdeep maintained its position as the premier trading city of the coast. The merchant houses of Am resumed their commercial expansion. The basic political structure of Faerun, shaken but not destroyed by the spell plague, reconstituted itself in forms that earlier generations would have recognized. Yet much had changed permanently. The destruction of so many settlements during the spell plague meant that ruins dotted the landscape, abandoned towns and fortresses that had never been reoccupied. The death toll from the catastrophe had created labor shortages that persisted for decades. Traditional noble families had been broken, their lineages ended, their power transferred to newcomers who had seized opportunity amid chaos. The world that emerged from the Sundering was recognizably Faerun, but it was a Faerun that had been transformed. The divine order that emerged from the Sundering operated under new rules. Ao established what some theologians call the New Covenant, a set of principles governing divine interaction with mortals. The gods were required to act through their followers more than through direct intervention. Miracles became rarer, divine manifestations less common. The age of gods walking openly among mortals had ended, replaced by a more distant relationship mediated through priests and chosen champions. The modern era of Faerun began in earnest around 1489 Dale reckoning. This date, roughly 5 years after the Sundering's completion, marks the point at which the world had sufficiently stabilized for normal political and economic activity to resume. The major powers had defined their borders. The magical systems functioned reliably. The divine order operated according to understood principles. What had been a world in crisis became a world in equilibrium, ready for new histories to be written. The Lord's Alliance bound many of the major powers of the Sword Coast together. This coalition included Waterdeep, Baldur's Gate, Neverwinter, Silvery Moon, and numerous other cities and states. Its purpose was mutual defense against external threats, particularly the many monstrous forces that threatened civilized lands. The alliance was not a unified government. Each member retained full sovereignty over its internal affairs. But the agreement to support each other against aggression provided security that no single power could achieve alone. The Harpers continued their ancient mission of opposing tyranny and preserving balance. This secretive organization, which had operated for centuries, worked behind the scenes to counter threats to freedom across Faerun. Their agents included bards and rogues and wizards, individuals who gathered information and took action without revealing their affiliation. The Harpers opposed the Zhentarim and other forces that sought domination, though their methods were often subtle enough that those they helped never knew of their involvement. The Zhentarim had transformed during the chaos of the Spell Plague and Sundering. What had once been a purely malevolent organization devoted to tyranny and conquest had become something more ambiguous. The modern Zhentarim functioned primarily as a mercenary network, selling services to anyone willing to pay. Their moral standards remained questionable, but they had become more pragmatic than ideological. Zhentarim agents could be found working alongside adventurers and merchants as easily as opposing them, their loyalties determined by gold rather than principle. The Emerald Enclave protected the natural world from exploitation. This druidic organization maintained sacred groves and wilderness preserves across Faerun, opposing those who would destroy nature for profit. Their concerns extended beyond simple conservation to include the balance between civilization and wilderness that allowed both to thrive. The Enclave worked with those who respected natural limits while opposing those who would strip the land of resources without thought for consequences. The Order of the Gauntlet brought righteous fury against evil. This militant organization drew members from multiple faiths, united by commitment to actively fighting evil wherever it arose. Where the Harpers worked in shadows, the Order of the Gauntlet marched openly, their paladins and clerics confronting threats with force rather than subtlety. They hunted undead, fought demons, and challenged tyrants, believing that evil must be destroyed rather than merely contained. These factions and many others competed for influence across Faerun. Their agents crossed paths in taverns and throne rooms, sometimes as allies and sometimes as rivals. The tension between these organizations created much of the political complexity of the modern era. Adventurers found themselves navigating these competing interests, sometimes serving one faction while opposing another, sometimes playing multiple sides against each other. The adventurers themselves represented a force unlike anything in earlier ages. The chaos of the Spell Plague and Sundering had created opportunities for individuals to acquire power that would have been extraordinary in more stable times. Ancient treasures had been exposed by earthquakes and eruptions. Barriers that had contained dangerous creatures had failed. The disruption of traditional authority structures left vacuums that bold individuals could fill. Those who survived the dangers and seized these opportunities became the adventurers, wanderers of tremendous capability who took on challenges that traditional institutions could not address. Waterdeep remained the greatest city in Faerûn at this modern juncture. Its population exceeded any other settlement on the continent. Its markets offered goods from every corner of the known world. Its political system, governed by the masked lords whose identities remained secret, provided stability that had endured for centuries. The City of Splendors attracted ambitious individuals from across Faerûn, all seeking to make their fortunes in its crowded streets. The Yawning Portal Tavern became famous as a gateway to adventure. This establishment in Waterdeep sat atop an entrance to Undermountain, the vast dungeon complex that stretched beneath the city. The mad wizard Halaster had created this labyrinth ages ago, and it had grown and changed over the centuries, absorbing other dungeons and connecting to the Underdark itself. Adventurers paid to be lowered into the depths, hoping to find treasure and glory in the darkness below. Many never returned. Baldur's Gate grew into the second city of the Sword Coast. Its population approached that of Waterdeep, and its influence extended throughout the region. The politics of Baldur's Gate were famously corrupt, its government dominated by wealthy merchants who treated the city as a business to be exploited. Yet this corruption created opportunities as well as problems, allowing flexible arrangements that more rigid governments would not permit. Neverwinter continued its rebuilding efforts under Lord Neverember's guidance. The city attracted settlers who saw opportunity in reconstruction, pioneers willing to work hard in exchange for the chance to build something new. The ruins of the pre-spell plague city provided materials and foundations. The surrounding territory, cleared of monsters by adventuring parties, offered farmland and resources. Neverwinter was not yet what it had been, but it was growing. Silvery Moon preserved the traditions of elven and human cooperation that Myth-Drana had once embodied. This northern city, nestled in a valley of the Nether Mountains, maintained schools of magic and art that drew students from across Faerûn. Its rulers had long worked to create a place where multiple races could live together in harmony. Though smaller than the great coastal cities, Silvery Moon punched above its weight in cultural influence. Luskan had fallen from its former prominence. This northern city, once known as the City of Sails, had been devastated during the conflicts of recent decades. Its famous pirate captains had been broken. Its magical defenses had failed. What remained was a shadow of former glory, a dangerous place controlled by criminal factions that could not agree on anything except their opposition to outside interference. The nations inland from the Sword Coast presented their own complexities. Cormyr remained the most stable human kingdom in Faerûn, its traditions of law and succession providing continuity that other nations lacked. The Purple Dragons, Cormyr's royal army, maintained order within the kingdom's borders while projecting power beyond them. The War Wizards, the kingdom's arcane core, provided magical support that enhanced Cormyr's military effectiveness. Together, these institutions made Cormyr a power that neighbors treated with respect. Sembia had changed during the chaos of recent decades. This nation of merchant princes, which had once rivaled Cormyr in power and wealth, had been conquered by the Shadowvar during the Spell Plague period. When the Shadowvar fell, Sembia was left weakened, its traditional power structures disrupted, its wealth diminished. The modern Sembia was a recovering nation, rebuilding its commerce while guarding against the return of outside domination. The Dalilans preserved their tradition of independence. These small communities, scattered across the lands between Cormyr and the Moonsea, had never unified into a larger state. Each dale governed itself, maintaining relations with its neighbors but never subordinating to external authority. This independence came at a cost, as the dales lacked the military power to resist determined aggression. But the dales survived because conquering them offered little profit while defending them would require occupying rugged terrain against a hostile population. They remained a threat to neighboring regions. The Magocracy had survived the Spell Plague better than many nations, its tradition of necromancy providing advantages in an age of magical chaos. The modern Thay was ruled by the Lich Shas Tam, an undead archmage who had achieved effective immortality and used it to consolidate power. Thay's neighbors watched its activities with concern. never certain when the Red Wizards might decide that military expansion was more profitable than trade. The Moonsea region had always been dangerous, and it remained so in the modern era. The cities that surrounded this inland sea competed with each other as much as they cooperated. Gentil Keep had been destroyed during the time of troubles but had been rebuilt, though never achieving its former importance. Hillsfar imposed brutal laws against non-humans, earning the hatred of elves and dwarves and halflings throughout the region. Mulmaster pursued its own course, neither joining alliances nor making unnecessary enemies. Flann stood as an example of recovery against all odds. This city on the northern Moonsea shore had been conquered, liberated, reconquered, and liberated again more times than historians could easily count. Yet its people persisted, rebuilding after each catastrophe, maintaining their community against endless threats. Flann attracted adventurers like few other cities, its perpetual need for defenders creating constant employment for those willing to fight. The Underdark remained the great unknown beneath Faerun's surface. This vast network of caverns and tunnels extended beneath the entire continent, containing civilizations and creatures unknown to surface dwellers. The Drow maintained their cities in the darkness, Menzoberranzan and other settlements where Lolth's worship dominated every aspect of life. Illithid colonies fed on the brains of captives, their elder brains plotting schemes that surfaced beings could barely comprehend. Duergar, the grey dwarves, worked their forges in the depths, producing weapons and armor for their own use and for trade. The relationship between surface and Underdark was one of intermittent warfare. Drow raids struck surface communities with irregular frequency, taking slaves and spreading terror before withdrawing to the depths. Surface expeditions ventured underground, seeking treasure or pursuing enemies, usually with disastrous results. A few trade routes connected the realms, carefully maintained channels through which goods flowed despite the dangers. The gods continued their eternal concerns above these mortal struggles. The divine order established after the Sundering operated according to rules that limited direct intervention while still allowing the gods significant influence. Clerics received spells and guidance from their deities. Divine champions carried out celestial agendas in the mortal world. The temples that dominated urban landscapes served as institutions of religion, education, and charity, their influence extending far beyond purely spiritual matters. Tyr had returned from apparent death, the god of justice restored to his portfolio. His clergy worked to establish fair laws and ensure their enforcement. The followers of Tyr filled courts and councils across Faerun, their devotion to justice providing a counterweight to corruption and tyranny. Not everyone welcomed their presence. Lawbreakers and tyrants had particular reason to fear the Tyran faith. Tempus blessed warriors and accepted their devotion regardless of which side they fought for. The god of war cared only that battle be joined honorably, that warriors face each other with courage, that conflict serve as the crucible in which strength was tested. His clergy included warriors of many faiths who acknowledged his domain over their profession. Before battles, commanders often prayed to Tempus, seeking his favor regardless of whether they worshipped him primarily. Kelemvor judged the dead with fairness that had replaced the cruelty of his predecessors. This god had once been mortal, his ascension during the time of troubles giving him perspective that the original Lord of the Dead had lacked. Kelemvor opposed undeath, seeing it as a perversion of the natural cycle that carried souls to their proper destinations. His clergy hunted necromancers and destroyed undead, performing a service that most living creatures appreciated. Suni inspired love and beauty throughout Faerun. Her worship was gentler than most, focused on appreciation of aesthetic pleasures and emotional connections rather than martial or magical power. The temples of Sune were places of beauty, their priests trained in arts of presentation and relationship that made them valuable in many social contexts. Where other faiths might seem stern, Sune's worship celebrated joy. Countless other deities received worship across the continent. Some had vast followings that spanned multiple nations. Others were honored in single communities or by particular professions. The diversity of faiths reflected the diversity of needs and values among Faerun's people. A sailor might pray to Umbali for safe passage, while a farmer invoked Shanti for good harvests. A merchant might seek Joaquin's blessing, while a scholar honored Ogma. This plurality of worship had characterized Faerun since the earliest days, and it continued in the modern era. The threats facing Faerun in this modern age were neither greater nor lesser than those of previous eras. Dragons still hoarded treasure and terrorized communities. Giants still descended from their mountain strongholds to raid human settlements. The undead still rose from corrupted ground, and demons still found ways to enter the material plane. These eternal dangers required eternal vigilance, creating constant demand for those willing to fight on civilization's behalf. Yet new threats had emerged as well. The cult of the dragon had grown more ambitious, shifting from merely creating Dracoliches to pursuing an apocalyptic agenda that threatened to destroy civilized life entirely. Demon lords had established footholds in the material world, their presence corrupting regions that would take generations to cleanse. Elemental cults pursued the destruction of established order, seeking to return the world to the primordial chaos from which it had been shaped. The emergence of heroes to face these threats was perhaps the most significant pattern of the modern era. Individuals of exceptional ability appeared throughout Faerun, drawn to adventure by circumstances beyond their control or by choice. These heroes were not products of traditional institutions. They came from taverns and farms, from city streets and forest clearings. They acquired power through experience, growing stronger with each challenge overcome. In a world where traditional authorities had been weakened by decades of chaos, these heroes filled gaps that no other force could address. The relationship between heroes and institutions was complex and often tense. The Lords of Waterdeep found adventurers useful for tasks that official forces could not handle, but they worried about independent powers operating within their city. The rulers of Cormyr valued the capabilities that adventurers brought to their kingdom's defense, but they required those same adventurers to obey laws that limited their freedom of action. This tension was inherent in a world where individual power could exceed that of traditional authorities. The current moment finds Faerun poised between recovery and renewed crisis. The wounds of the spell plague have largely healed, the Sundering has restored much of what was lost, the great powers have established boundaries and relationships that provide baseline stability, trade flows, communities grow, life continues. But the threats never truly diminish. The demons wait in the abyss, the dragons sleep in their hordes, the drow plot in Menzoberranzan. The next catastrophe is always gathering, even if its shape cannot yet be discerned. The legacy of every age lives on in the present. The creator races left behind ruins and artifacts that explorers still discover. The elven empires shaped forests that still stand. Netheryl's fall created the desert that still dominates the north. The Crown Wars produced the drow, who still trouble the surface world. The Time of Troubles established divine rules that still govern the gods. The spell plague scarred lands that still bear the marks of magical chaos. Every moment of Faerunian history contributed something to the present, building the world that exists today from countless accumulated decisions and events. The structure of the world itself reflects this accumulated history. The geography of Faerun is not merely physical terrain but layered memory. The Sword Coast carries traces of Illifarn and the elven nations that preceded human self-settlement. The Anauroch Desert conceals the ruins of Netheril beneath its sands. The Underdark networks were shaped by creator, race engineering, and millennia of subsequent development. Every region tells stories to those who know how to read the land. The people of Faerun carry their history in culture and tradition. Elven songs remember events that humans have long forgotten. Dwarven halls display craftsmanship that connects modern smiths to ancient masters. Human nations celebrate festivals whose origins trace back beyond recorded memory. Even those who know nothing of formal history participate in patterns established by their ancestors, perpetuating customs whose meanings have been lost but whose forms endure. Magic itself is historical, shaped by accumulated knowledge and catastrophe. The spells that modern wizards cast descend from Netherese innovations, elven high magic, the experiments of countless practitioners across millennia. The weave that channels arcane power has been destroyed and restored, altered and repaired, until its current configuration reflects everything that has been done to it. A wizard casting a fireball participates in a tradition extending back to the earliest days of human spellcasting. The gods, too, are historical beings, changed by their experiences across the ages. Mystra is not the original goddess who bore that name, but a successor who inherited the portfolio. Many modern deities ascended from mortality during historical events, their divine perspectives shaped by their mortal experiences. Even the oldest gods have been transformed by events, their portfolios expanded or contracted, their relationships with worshippers changed by the accumulated weight of millennia. This is the Forgotten Realms as it exists today, a world of ancient depth and modern vitality. A place where gods and mortals share the stage, where magic shapes every aspect of existence, where the past is never truly past because its consequences still unfold. The kingdoms rise and fall. The empires expand and contract. The heroes emerge and are replaced by new heroes. But the world endures, carrying forward the accumulated weight of everything that has come before, while remaining open to everything that might come next. The name itself carries meaning. The Forgotten Realms refers not merely to a geographical location, but to the relationship between knowledge and obscurity that defines this world. So much has been lost across the ages. The creator races took their secrets with them when they departed. Netheral's libraries were buried under desert sand. Mythdrana's archives burned during its fall. Yet enough survives, in ruins and artifacts and half-remembered lore, that the past can never be entirely forgotten. It waits beneath the surface, ready to be rediscovered by those bold enough to seek it. The future remains unwritten. The patterns of the past suggest what might come, but prediction is impossible in a world where divine intervention can reshape reality overnight. Will there be another spell plague, another time of troubles, another rise and fall of empires? Almost certainly, given the scope of Faerunian history. But the specific forms these events might take cannot be known in advance. The world continues to generate new stories, new heroes, new crises, new resolutions. Those who walk the roads of Faerun today walk in the footsteps of countless predecessors. The paths they travel were worn by feet stretching back to the earliest ages. The cities they visit were built on foundations laid by forgotten civilizations. The dungeons they explore were shaped by forces both mortal and divine. The treasure they seek was created by smiths and mages who died before human history began. Every adventure connects the present to the deep past, whether the adventurers know it or not. This is the world that remains, carrying forward every triumph and tragedy of the ages that came before, offering new challenges to each generation, preserving mysteries that may never be solved, while creating new mysteries for future explorers to pursue.